what we have here is a simple line graph. So a simple line graph basically means that in the graph that you see, there is only one line telling you about one type of data. So in this case, it's helpful to look at the question here, which sets the context for you as to what the line graph is talking about. So here it says, study the figure which shows the number of tourists arriving in Singapore by air from 2008 to 2023. So normally the context of the question tells you what the information is about here. So in this case, number of tourists coming into Singapore by airplanes, and it also tells you the time period. So 2008 to 2023. So another important element to look at in your graph is the title of the graph. So the title of the graph in this case just provides you with the context of it. So international air arrivals to Singapore, if you looked at the title first and you didn't understand what international air arrivals mean, that's when you look back at the question, which could explain this title in a different manner, in a way that's perhaps more easily understood by students. Okay, so there are two ways to find the context: in the question itself and from the title of the graph. Another thing you should pay attention to is the units. Millions in this case. So for example, why millions is important is because if we look at, for example here, 2008, we're looking at the number 7.2. 7.2 million people versus 7.2 people are completely different scales. So when you write an answer and you say that in 2008 there are 7.2 people, you are not credited the mark for it because you had not given data using the right units. So for example, if you have a question on the graph that's worth 3 marks, it is possible that you get a maximum of only 2 marks if you do not quote the right units. Okay, so another thing that you may have heard from your teacher is the idea of what is overall trend. So teachers may tell you, okay, when you describe things about the graph, normally you focus on something overall, then you go to a significant trend, and then you go into an exception. So by overall trend, we mean that from the start, so at the beginning here, 7.2 in 2008, all the way to 9.4 in 2023, from the start of the period to the end of the period, that is the overall that we're talking about. When we talk about specific or very significant trends, we're talking about, is there a time period between 2008 and 2023 that we can specifically take note of? So for example, some students may talk about 7.2 to 7.2. This is a time period whereby the numbers are similar. That is a significant thing they spotted. That's okay. Some students may want to talk about this thing. 14.9 dropped all the way to 0.3. To them, that is significant and that is okay. Some students may want to focus on a more gradual decline from 2013 to 2014. That's also okay. So whatever significant trend you're going to talk about, make sure that it's in a smaller time period compared to the overall time period of the graph. And then what is an exception? An exception basically is the reverse of the overall trend. So in the overall trend, you've noticed that 7.2 million to 9.4 million is an increase. So if I were to look for an exception, I need to look for periods of time whereby a decrease had happened. And that would be my exception. So exceptions exist in these years and in these years, 2019 to 2021. Moving on to the next graph. Here, we see a comparative line graph. So comparative line graphs just mean that you have more than one graph. In this case, you have 2. Some cases, you have 3 or even more than that. So the tricky thing about these graphs is that you need to pay attention to what the question is asking you for. Is it asking you to focus on Malaysia? Is it asking you to focus on Dubai? Or are they asking you to compare between both countries? So let's go back to what we mentioned previously, looking at the question context. So the question says, the figure is about number of tourists arriving in Dubai and Malaysia from 1995 to 2003. So the context is given, again it's repeated in the title here, and this time the title also includes the units for you. Okay, thousands basically, this means thousands. It repeats itself here, it also tells you it's in thousands in the axis here. So this means that whenever you quote data, make sure the data you quote is in thousands. For example, if you look at Malaysia, in 1995, it's 100. But it's not 100 tourists, it's 100,000 tourists. Okay, so these kinds of questions are a bit trickier because they are distractors in the question. So for example, the question asks you to describe a trend on Malaysia. The distractor in the question is then Dubai, because some students may happily write about Dubai, forgetting that the question is asking them about Malaysia. The opposite is true too. If the question is about Dubai, some students may see Malaysia and misread the graph to talk about Malaysia. So that's why it's very, very important to pay attention to what the question is asking you for.